For 30 years, the most powerful military on earth refused to do one thing. Every chairman of the Joint Chiefs, every Secretary of Defense, every military strategist who briefed the White House said the same thing behind closed doors. Do not go to war with Iran. It didn't matter who was president. Bush heard it. Obama heard it. Biden heard it twice in a single year when pressure mounted in 2024. The Pentagon's position never changed. Iran is not Iraq. It's 4 times the size. It has triple the population. Its geography is a nightmare for invaders. And most critically, it has the ability to shut down the single most important energy corridor on the planet. So the question that analysts across the world are now asking is straightforward. What happens when that resistance gets overridden? What happens when political calculation replaces military judgment? And what happens when the country on the receiving end turns out to be far more strategically capable than anyone in Washington publicly admitted? The answers to those questions are already unfolding, and they affect not just the Middle East, but every economy, every gas station, and every household budget on Earth. To understand how this situation reached the point it has, you have to understand the pressure campaign that ran for decades. According to multiple reports and confirmed by several former U.S. officials, there was sustained and aggressive lobbying to draw America into a direct military confrontation with Iran. The argument was always the same. The regime is fragile. A decisive strike at the top would cause it to crumble, hit the leadership, destroy the nuclear sites, and a new government friendly to Western interests would emerge from the rubble. The military never bought it, not because they were soft, but because they had studied the problem. Wargaming a conflict with Iran was something the Pentagon did regularly, and every simulation pointed to the same conclusion. You could bomb Iran. You could hit every known nuclear facility. You could take out every major government building in Thran. And when the dust settled, you would still be facing a country of 90 million people spread across terrain that makes Afghanistan look like a parking lot with an arsenal of short and medium-range ballistic missiles that could set the entire Gulf on fire. That assessment never changed. What changed was who was listening to it. Now here's where the strategic picture becomes genuinely alarming, and it's something most mainstream coverage has barely touched. According to military analysts and several defense officials who have spoken either on record or on background, Iran did not respond the way anyone in Washington expected. The assumption was that Iran would attempt to strike back at American military assets directly, carrier groups, air bases, the kind of targets that the U.S. military has built to defend. Instead, according to multiple reports, Iran pursued what strategists call an asymmetric economic warfare strategy. Rather than going after the warships, they went after the money. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf became the primary target set. Oil terminals, refineries, loading platforms, pipeline junctions, desalination plants that entire nations depend on for drinking water. These are not hardened military targets. They are sprawling, exposed, and nearly impossible to fully defend. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this strategy. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through this narrow waterway every single day. Iran controls the northern shore, and according to naval analysts, Iran has the capability to mine the strait, deploy fast attack boats, and launch anti-ship missiles from concealed coastal positions that would make any attempt to keep the strait open extraordinarily costly. Reports indicate that Iran moved quickly to threaten this choke point, not by closing it entirely, at least not immediately, but by making transit dangerous and unpredictable enough that insurance rates for tankers skyrocketed and shipping companies began rerouting. The effect was almost immediate. Global oil prices surged, and this was before any full closure. What makes this strategy so effective, according to defense analysts, is that Iran doesn't need to win a conventional military battle to achieve its objectives. It just needs to keep the pressure on long enough for the economic pain to become politically unbearable in Washington. And that brings us to the escalation problem that several prominent strategists have described as the most dangerous feature of this conflict. The concept that gets thrown around in Washington is escalation dominance, the idea that the United States can always go one step higher than its adversary and that the adversary will eventually back down because they know they can't match American firepower. In theory, this makes sense. The U.S. military is the most powerful conventional force in history, but theory and reality have a way of diverging when the shooting starts, and the historical record on this point is remarkably clear. Air campaigns alone have never produced regime change, not once. The United States firebombed Tokyo on the night of March 10, 1945, killing more people in a single night than died at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The Japanese did not surrender. The U.S. then systematically firebombed every major Japanese city for the next 5 months. The Japanese still did not surrender. It took 2 nuclear weapons and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria to finally end the war. And even then, it was the Soviet entry, according to several historians, that tipped the balance more than the bombs themselves. In Korea, the United States essentially leveled North Korea from the air. Every significant structure was destroyed. The population endured devastation that is difficult to even comprehend today. The regime did not fall. In Vietnam, the U.S. dropped more tonnage of bombs than it used in all of World War II. The regime did not fall. In every single case, the population rallied around the government rather than turning against it. So when analysts hear talk of bombing Iran into submission or destroying enough infrastructure to force regime change through air power alone, the historical response is unambiguous. It doesn't work. It has never worked. And there is no credible reason to believe it would work now against a country that is larger, more geographically dispersed, and more ideologically cohesive than most of the examples above. This is the trap that several strategists warned about before the conflict began. You start bombing because you believe it will be quick and decisive. When it isn't, you bomb harder. When that doesn't work either, you escalate again. Each step up the ladder brings new consequences, and each consequence creates pressure to take the next step. According to analysts, if the U.S. or its allies target Iranian energy infrastructure, Iran retaliates against Gulf energy infrastructure. If desalination plants are hit inside Iran, reports suggest Iran would target desalination facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and potentially Israel. Several of these nations are almost entirely dependent on desalinated water. Taking out those plants doesn't just cause economic damage, it creates a humanitarian catastrophe within days. And this is where the global economic picture becomes genuinely terrifying. The world runs on oil. This is not an exaggeration, and it's not a political statement. It is a basic physical and economic fact. Oil doesn't just power cars, it powers industrial production, electricity generation, shipping, agriculture, chemical manufacturing, and virtually every supply chain on the planet. When the supply of oil is disrupted at the scale the Persian Gulf represents, the effects don't stay contained to one region. They cascade. According to economic analysts, Europe faces the most acute vulnerability. European nations already lost access to cheap Russian energy following the war in Ukraine. They pivoted to increased reliance on Middle Eastern and American sources. If Gulf oil is significantly disrupted on top of the existing Russian shortfall, several European economies that are already stagnating could face genuine crisis. Energy prices would spike. Industrial output would contract. Inflation, which has only recently been brought under partial control, would surge again. Japan and South Korea are in an even more exposed position. Both nations are heavily dependent on Gulf oil imports and have limited strategic reserves relative to their consumption. A sustained disruption would hit their economies within weeks, not months. But the damage wouldn't stop with developed nations. Developing countries across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia would face the worst consequences proportionally. Nations like Nigeria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which are already managing fragile economic conditions, could be pushed into severe crisis by energy price shocks they have no ability to absorb. Several economists have used the word depression, not recession. Depression. And while it's important to note that this represents a worst-case scenario rather than a certainty, the fact that credible analysts are even modeling this possibility tells you how serious the risk has become. Now, there's another dimension to this conflict that hasn't received nearly enough attention, and that's the role of Russia and China. Both nations have enormous strategic incentives to see the United States struggle in a prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. This is not speculation, it is basic strategic logic that both governments have articulated in various ways over the past decade. A United States that is pinned down, burning through military resources, and facing domestic political pressure over an unpopular war is a United States that has less bandwidth to focus on the Indo-Pacific or Eastern Europe. According to multiple intelligence assessments reported in Western media, Russia has been providing significant intelligence support to Iran, satellite imagery, electronic signals data, real-time information about the positioning and movement of American and allied assets. This is exactly what the United States has done for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. The symmetry is not lost on anyone involved. China's role, according to analysts, has been more focused on technology transfers. Reports surfaced before the current escalation that China had supplied advanced air defense systems and long-range radar capable of tracking stealth aircraft. If accurate, this would significantly complicate American air operations and reduce the effectiveness of what has traditionally been the U.S. military's greatest advantage, its ability to strike with near impunity from the air. And here's what makes this dynamic particularly concerning for long-term U.S. strategic planning. According to several analysts, Russian and Chinese support for Iran is likely to increase, not decrease, as the conflict continues. Both nations see an opportunity to accelerate the shift toward a multipolar world order. A decisive American setback in the Middle East would, in their calculation, fundamentally reshape how every nation on Earth evaluates the value of an American security guarantee, which leads directly to the situation facing the Gulf states. And this may be the most consequential piece of the entire puzzle. For decades, the security architecture of the Persian Gulf was built on a single premise: the United States would protect Gulf nations from Iran. American bases, American ships, American missile defense systems, all stationed across the Gulf, as a guarantee that Iran could not threaten its neighbors without facing American power. According to multiple reports, that premise is now being questioned more seriously than at any point in modern history. The Gulf states were not consulted before the current escalation. They did not participate in the decision-making process, and they are now absorbing the consequences of a war they did not choose in the form of Iranian strikes on infrastructure that their populations depend on for survival. Several Gulf nations had already begun hedging before the current conflict. Saudi Arabia's strategic partnership with Pakistan, which reportedly includes a nuclear security component, is one example. Turkey's interest in joining that arrangement is another. These are not the actions of nations that feel confident in American protection. These are the actions of nations that are looking for alternatives. The fundamental question that Gulf leaders are reportedly grappling with is straightforward. Are American bases on their soil assets or liabilities? Before the current conflict, the answer seemed obvious. Now, according to several diplomatic sources, it is not obvious at all. Those bases, which were supposed to deter Iran, have instead turned Gulf nations into targets. The very infrastructure that was meant to provide security has attracted the strikes that are now threatening the economic and humanitarian foundations of those countries. And all of this circles back to the most critical question: how does this end? According to virtually every strategic analyst who has commented publicly, there is no clear off-ramp visible. The domestic political framing in Washington focuses on American and Israeli objectives: regime change, unconditional surrender, decisive victory. But analysts point out that these conversations almost entirely ignore the fact that Iran has to agree to any deal. And Iran, according to all available evidence, has no incentive to agree to terms that don't address its core demands. What would Iran likely require? Analysts point to three primary demands. First, comprehensive sanctions relief. Sanctions have strangled the Iranian economy for years, and any deal that leaves them in place would be seen as a loss domestically. Second, security guarantees. Iran has been attacked twice in less than a year, according to reports. Any agreement that doesn't include credible assurances against future attacks would be rejected. Third, and most controversially, reparations. Whether this takes the form of direct payments or frozen asset releases, analysts suggest Iran will demand economic compensation. The political difficulty for Washington is obvious. Meeting these demands would look to domestic audiences like concession, and concession in the middle of an election cycle is something no American president wants to be associated with. But the alternative, continuing a war that is driving the global economy toward crisis, eroding alliances, and demonstrating the limits of American power, carries its own devastating political costs. Several analysts have drawn a comparison to the final years of the Vietnam War, when American leaders understood privately that the war was unwinnable, but continued fighting because no one wanted to be the president who lost. The cost of that delay was measured in years of additional destruction and thousands of additional lives. There is one more dimension that deserves attention, and it concerns the long-term trajectory of the region. According to multiple analysts, the current conflict is accelerating nuclear proliferation pressures across the Middle East. If Iran emerges from this conflict more determined to pursue a nuclear weapons capability, and several experts believe this is now the most likely outcome, it would trigger a cascade of proliferation across the region. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, nations that have historically relied on American security guarantees, would face enormous domestic pressure to pursue their own nuclear deterrence. The irony that analysts keep pointing to is striking. The conflict that was supposed to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power may ultimately guarantee that it does. And not only Iran, but several of its neighbors as well. What we're watching unfold is not just a military conflict. According to strategists, economists, and diplomatic analysts, it is a potential inflection point in the global order. The outcome will determine not just who controls territory in the Middle East, but whether the security architecture that has governed international relations for decades can survive the strain being placed on it. The economic consequences are already being felt. Energy prices are climbing, supply chains are under stress, financial markets are pricing in uncertainty that hasn't been seen in decades, and every week that the conflict continues without a diplomatic resolution, the costs compound. There are no easy answers here. There may not be any good answers. But understanding the strategic dynamics, the historical patterns, and economic stakes is the first step toward making sense of what is rapidly becoming the defining geopolitical crisis of this era. The question isn't whether this situation is dangerous. Every credible analyst agrees that it is. The question is whether the people making the decisions understand just how dangerous it has become. And based on what we've seen so far, that remains very much an open question. There's a detail that keeps surfacing in expert discussions that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, and it changes how you think about the entire conflict. It concerns the missile defense equation. The United States and Israel operate some of the most sophisticated missile defense systems ever built. Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, THAAD, Patriot batteries. On paper, these systems represent an impenetrable shield. In practice, according to defense analysts, they face a fundamental mathematical problem that no amount of technology can solve. Defensive interceptors are expensive. Offensive missiles and drones are cheap. Every interceptor fired costs anywhere from several $100,000 to several $1 million. Many of the drones being launched cost a fraction of that. And more critically, interceptors are finite. Once your stockpile is exhausted, there is no quick way to replenish it. Manufacturing these systems takes months, sometimes years. You cannot surge production overnight. Iran, according to military assessments, possesses one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East. Thousands of short-range missiles, hundreds of medium and long-range missiles, and an enormous inventory of drones that can be produced quickly and cheaply. The math is simple and brutal. If Iran launches enough projectiles and sustained waves, the defense systems run dry, and once they run dry, everything behind them is exposed. Several analysts have noted that reports suggest a significant portion of American interceptor stockpiles are redirected to Israel, which raises a secondary problem. Every interceptor sent to Israel is one that is no longer available to protect Gulf installations or American bases in the region. This creates a zero-sum competition for defensive resources among allies who are all simultaneously under threat. This is not a problem that can be solved by building more interceptors, at least not in the time frame of the current conflict. It is a structural vulnerability that Iran appears to understand and is reportedly exploiting deliberately through sustained distributed attacks designed to exhaust defensive capabilities over time rather than overwhelm them in a single strike. And this connects to a broader pattern that military historians have identified across centuries of conflict, the defender's dilemma. When you have to defend everything, you can defend nothing effectively. Iran doesn't need to know exactly where every defensive battery is positioned. It just needs to launch enough projectiles across enough targets to ensure that some get through. And in a target-rich environment like the Persian Gulf, where critical infrastructure is concentrated and exposed, even a small percentage of successful strikes can cause catastrophic damage. This is why several former military officials have described the current strategic position as fundamentally unsustainable. Not because American forces lack capability, but because the nature of the conflict favors the attacker in ways that no amount of defensive technology can fully offset. There's also the question of what this conflict is doing to America's broader strategic position globally. The United States maintains military commitments on every continent. It has security obligations in Europe, where NATO depends on American leadership. It has commitments in the Indo-Pacific, where China's growing military capabilities demand constant attention. It has partnerships across Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. Every resource committed to the Middle East is a resource that is not available elsewhere. Every ship deployed to the Gulf is a ship that is not in the South China Sea. Every interceptor sent to Israel is one that cannot be positioned in South Korea or Japan. According to strategic analysts, this is precisely the scenario that both Russia and China have been hoping for. An America that is stretched thin, burning through expensive munitions in a conflict that produces no clear victory, while its global competitors use the distraction to advance their own positions. Several analysts have pointed to increased Chinese military activity around Taiwan in recent months, noting that it coincides with American attention being focused almost entirely on the Middle East. Whether this represents a deliberate strategy of opportunism or simply a coincidence of timing is debated, but the effect is the same. American strategic bandwidth is being consumed by a single conflict, while challenges multiply elsewhere. This is what strategists call imperial overstretch. It's a concept that has been studied extensively by historians from the decline of the Roman Empire to the collapse of the British Empire to the Soviet Union's experience in Afghanistan. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Great powers decline not because they are defeated in a single battle, but because they commit resources to conflicts that drain their strength over time while failing to produce strategic gains that justify the cost. Whether the current conflict will be remembered as a turning point in American global leadership or simply another costly chapter in an ongoing story remains to be seen. But the structural dynamics that analysts are identifying bear an uncomfortable resemblance to historical patterns that did not end well for the power at the center. What makes this moment different from previous American military engagements, according to several geopolitical analysts, is the speed at which economic consequences are materializing in Vietnam. The economic costs accumulated over years. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial burden built gradually across 2 decades. In the current conflict, the economic shock has been nearly instantaneous because of the centrality of Gulf energy to the global economy. Markets have already priced in significant disruption, but according to several economists, current pricing may actually underestimate the risk because it assumes a relatively short conflict. If the situation becomes protracted, if the Strait of Hormuz remains partially or fully restricted for months rather than weeks, the economic models that analysts rely on enter territory that has no modern precedent. The last comparable disruption to global energy supplies was the 1973 oil embargo, which triggered a global recession, reshaped international politics, and fundamentally altered the relationship between energy-producing and energy-consuming nations. And that embargo involved a fraction of the supply volume that is currently at risk. So where does this leave us? According to the analysts, strategists, economists, and former officials who have weighed in, the situation is balanced on a knife's edge. There are scenarios in which diplomatic channels produce a resolution before the worst economic and humanitarian consequences materialize. There are also scenarios in which escalation continues, costs mount, and the conflict becomes the kind of generational strategic disaster that reshapes the international order.